Welcome to DeProgram. I'm Michelle Witte. I am here with Ted Rall and John Kiriakou. We want to talk today about Mifepristone, which John and I have been talking about a few months ago. It's been in the news a lot. It had kind of died down, but it came up pretty prominently in Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Senate confirmation hearings last week. And around the same time, a judge in Texas made a maybe dubious legal move to keep alive a lawsuit aiming to rescind FDA approval for the drug. So we wanted to talk about, how we should feel about Mifepristone coming back into the news, being discussed in this confirmation hearing, especially in terms of its safety, and then what the hell is going on down in Texas. Joining us for this conversation is Director of Federal Abortion Policy at the National Women's Law Center, Katie O'Connor. Thanks for joining us, Katie.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, to refresh everybody's memories before we get into the current details, Mifepristone is a drug that is used in combination with another drug to end pregnancies. It was approved by the FDA in 2000 for use up to 7 weeks gestation. Then it was approved in 2016 for use up to 10 weeks. To me, it has always been a little strange that these anti-abortion groups are going after Mifepristone, because even if you made Mifepristone unavailable, you can still have a medication abortion. With the other drug, Mifepristone, it's just that your abortion might be more uncomfortable. You might feel worse for a longer time. The process is slightly less effective, though still very effective. So getting rid of Mifepristone is not going to stop medical abortions from happening. It will just make them more uncomfortable and maybe a tiny bit worse. Mifepristone is currently very popular. I found data as of 2021 showing that more than half of abortions in the United States are medication abortion, which by its very nature means more than half of abortions in the United States are taking place within 10 weeks of gestation. And actually, the CDC noted that actually nearly 80% of abortions in the United States take place within 9 weeks of pregnancy. So all of this howling again about late-term abortions is about there's a really small number of people who are getting abortions after 10 weeks. I'll also note one other thing, because I went on kind of a data dive this morning, but I took a look at the case fatality rate for abortions, because again, all of this questioning of Mifepristone is ostensibly about its safety. And there's been no major change in the very low fatality rate of abortions in the United States in general, certainly not when Mifepristone began to be used. There's no upward movement. There was a drop in the period from 2013 to 2022 after Mifepristone was approved for use later in pregnancy. And I say this all just again to drive home the point that challenges to Mifepristone over safety for women are totally disingenuous, right? That is, again, beside the point that it is much more dangerous to give birth than to have an abortion, and much more dangerous to give birth in the United States than in a lot of our peer nations. But I don't want to digress too much. I just wanted to kind of set the stage there and then get into some of these questions that we had for Katie. So I want to start with this confirmation hearing for RFK Jr., where at least a couple of conservative senators brought up Mifepristone to say, when you get, if you're confirmed, you're going to look into the safety of all drugs, including Mifepristone, et cetera, et cetera. And RFK Jr. did say that he was going to ask the NIH and the FDA to investigate drug safety issues. I don't know if we should take that as him throwing a bone to these conservative senators. It's not like he said, I'm going to let you set up a congressional committee to investigate the safety of this drug. But how?
Sorry, Michelle, you cut out for a second there, but I think I get the gist of your question. So I just want to start by sort of reiterating what you've already said, which is that the number is now like almost two-thirds of abortions in the United States are through medication abortion. Abortion overall is incredibly safe, as is medication abortion. So mifepristone is safe. There's no question about that. It's been in use in the United States for 25 years. It was approved by the FDA in 2000 after the usual very rigorous process for approving FDA-approved drugs. I think I was interested in hearing RFK Jr.'s responses, seemingly open to reopening a question about the safety and efficacy of mifepristone. But I really appreciated Senator Hassan's response and some of the things she said. She said she was talking in the context of vaccines, but she was saying, you can always question something's safety. You can always reopen it, relitigate the safety of a medication or drug. And that's no different with vaccines than it is with mifepristone. But there's just no reason to think that that there's any safety risk here. Nothing has changed except that we have more evidence of how safe and how effective mifepristone is now in 2025 than we did 25 years ago when it was first approved by the FDA.
So, I mean, are you expecting these attacks to continue on the issue of safety?
We're gonna kind of have to see. What is clear to me is that RFK Jr. is not an ideologue on, I don't think, anything, especially abortion, and neither is his boss, President Trump. So doing this work, I know the laundry list of attacks that could come on abortion access, including on access to mifepristone. But I don't know which of those this administration is going to have the appetite to take on. What we've seen over the past 2.5 years, and especially with the election in 2022 and in 2024, is that abortion remains very popular. It has always been the case that the American public support abortion rights, support abortion access. And that has not changed since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And in fact, people have become much more vocal about their support for abortion access. So I think Trump is probably, towing a fine line here between giving to his base and to the people he sees as having elected him enough to make them, enough to keep them happy, but also recognizing that I think there could be and would be really serious backlash if this administration did something really radical that really unsettled the landscape of abortion care in this country.
I want to also ask before we get to where to continue this fight. I want to ask if you can explain a little bit what is going on in this case in Texas. There was a case that was brought. I think it's called the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, or whatever. It's a bunch of anti-abortion doctors. They found a very friendly judge in Texas, and they brought this case trying to get the FDA to rescind its approval of mifepristone. And the original judge sided with them. There was an appeals court decision that sort of modified his decision, but didn't totally reverse it. But I think in a relief to a lot of people, the Supreme Court threw it out, and they threw it out because they found the plaintiffs had no standing. And I remember at the time talking about this case, the people behind this case couldn't find a single woman to join them who'd said, I had a medication abortion. I think I was subjected to a dangerous procedure. They couldn't find a single doctor who prescribes mifepristone who had realized that he was prescribing a dangerous drug or something. It was just a bunch of people sort of presenting hypotheticals about women coming to an emergency room and then having to care for them against their conscience. So the Supreme Court, in my non-lawyer opinion, correctly threw this out. But 3 states had signed on to the case to support it. Idaho, Kansas, and Missouri, I believe. And the judge is allowing them to continue with their effort in his jurisdiction, in a move that I have heard described as sort of dubious, because if the original case is decided, like it's tossed out, then what are you continuing? So can you explain to us a little bit what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I will say to start, like this case has been sort of fabricated from the very beginning. The organization that brought that, is the lead plaintiff on this case, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, that organization was like incorporated in Amarillo, Texas, just a month or two before this case was filed. It was incorporated there because they know if they file a suit in Amarillo, Texas, they will get this judge, Matthew Kaczmarek. And so it was sort of fabricated from the beginning. I think as soon as it was clear that the standing for these organizational plaintiffs and for the doctors was a little uncertain, these three, anti-abortion states intervened. There is really no legal basis for Judge Kaczmarek having allowed this case to continue, even though the original plaintiffs were found to lack standing. This is really just like him it's a power grab for him, and he's handing to the Trump administration an opportunity to weigh in on this case. But there's very little law to back up what's happening in Texas.
I don't understand. Could the states even be making the same argument as because right, wasn't the argument of the original plaintiffs like, I as a doctor am going to be forced to perform a procedure that violates my conscience because of Mifepristone, which can't be the argument of a government of a state, I wouldn't think.
Right. It is a different argument. So you're right that, the claim that the doctors were making is that they would be forced to participate in some kind of abortion procedure against sort of their moral or religious objection. What's interesting about that and why they lost on the standing issue is because, especially in the Supreme Court oral argument, they were kind of grilled even by the justices who you would expect to be very friendly to their argument about, well, what is the actual injury that you have sustained here? And the reality is they hadn't sustained an injury, and that's why they lack standing. The state's arguments are a little bit different. They have some kind of normal arguments, and then frankly, some arguments that are pretty wild and pretty offensive. They argue that there's sort of an economic impact on their states because Mifepristone may lead to the need for follow-up care for people, and that their hospitals and their providers are going to be, forced to provide that care, and that will have an economic impact on the state. They also argue that they have sort of a sovereign interest in passing their own laws about abortion and being able to enforce those laws. But then the weirder arguments that you may have heard about, because I think people were so appalled to know that these were in, a state's legal brief. They argue that the state has sort of a parental interest in potential abortion care for girls that are in foster care, which I would just, my jaw dropped when I saw that. And then they also, I think this got a little bit more reporting. They also argued that, the availability of mifepristone and medication abortions in their states could lead to a decreased population, which would lead to less representation in Congress and fewer federal resources. So those are the arguments that the federal government.
It's ridiculous.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to read the complaints is really wild, but that is what they're arguing. And frankly, before this judge, Matthew Kaczmarek, like some of these arguments are probably gonna.
Well, and of course, there's also this question of the states weighing in on the issue of this of public safety, right? I mean, so it's the right of a federal regulator in case of the FDA versus states' rights sort of seems to be clashing here. I wanted to ask you about that. I also wanted to ask you about this case in Louisiana where they've indicted the mother of a teenager. We don't know how old she is, but just that she's under 18, and who presumably lives in Louisiana, so is vulnerable, but as well as a New York doctor who shipped the drug to them. And obviously isn't going to go to on vacation to Mardi Gras, I imagine, this year, but is, nevertheless is being protected by New York's recently passed shield law. Governor Kathy Hochul of New York says that she's not going to honor an extradition request by the state of Louisiana, but Louisiana is saying, come down here and face Louisiana justice. Whatever that's a terrifying prospect. I mean, what is the, does a case like that have many legs? And, I mean, is it how solid are these shield laws? I mean, can states start getting into the business of saying we're going to pick and choose who we extradite based on which offenses to which states for various offenses?
I mean, I think we're just gonna have to see how this litigation plays out. As somebody who advocates for abortion rights and for abortion access, I'm very glad that states that wanted to protect access and expand access have been so sort of proactive in trying to protect their providers and protect the people who seek and receive care in their states. But we are on sort of uncharted waters here in terms of in terms of whether these shield laws will hold up in court. So, this litigation, so there's the case that you talked about, the doctor in New York who has been criminally indicted by Louisiana, but there's also a case out of Texas that sues another or a different New York provider. So this litigation is likely to take years. I really don't know what we can expect, except I will say, I do think that we're going to see blue states really reluctant to comply any more than they absolutely have to. That was part of the purpose of shield laws. And so I think you're going to see a lot of pushback from blue states who want to protect access within their states, saying we're not doing Texas and New York, But I think the other thing that is important to remember here is even if these shield laws hold up and providers in, protective states can continue to provide abortion care, all of this litigation just contributes to a climate of fear and chaos, both for providers and for patients. And that is sort of like what we've seen generally in the post-Dobbs world. There's the laws are constantly shifting under people's feet, and there's a lot of fear and disinformation and misinformation, and that all contributes to, lack of access and just a sense of fear and chaos on the ground. And so, regardless of the outcome of these cases, which will take years to get to, it's just destabilizing while the cases are litigated.
Katie, let me ask you about the mails, right? I mean, that's obviously how these drugs are being sent from northern blue states to southern red states. And there's, now the Trump administration is in. Trump's the postmaster general that he appointed is in office. He's engaged in an extremely aggressive takeover of federal agencies. I know the postal service is quasi-governmental and not and sort of somewhat independent. But what are the are you worried about the administration in being involved in interdiction of the mails, when these drugs cross state lines? And that's a two-part question. The other question is, legally, let's say Louisiana has its legislation. Can they interfere with the delivery of the mail to, like, if they catch wind that if, like, for example, can they use the mail covers program and scan for this New York doctor's address and say, okay, anything that comes in from her will intercept and not deliver to the addressee's home?
I mean, I'm very concerned about the mail. As you all may know, there is a 150-year-old law called the Comstock Act. It's an anti-vice law, so it really was meant to prohibit the mailing of anything that sort of led to promiscuity or indecency. It has been understood for the past 100 years to not apply to legal abortion care. And in fact, every court of appeals that's considered that case has said, like, this doesn't apply to, abortion care that is prescribed by a doctor in the normal course of business. But it is certainly within the realm of possibility that this administration would try to misapply the Comstock Act and enforce it against providers who are mailing Mifepristone medication abortion across state lines. I really think that what this administration does is really coming down to sort of how Trump himself lands on what he thinks he can get away with without a huge pushback from his supporters. So there are so many ways that this administration could restrict access to abortion, could punish abortion providers and even abortion patients. And I don't know what to expect in terms of how far they're going to go.
I think because, as you say, he's not an ideologue, Donald Trump. RFK Jr. is still, calling himself pro-choice, right? But said clearly in his confirmation hearing, I'm here to, execute the will of the president, right? The plans of the president. I do think you'd probably have to drag them kicking and screaming to do anything really radical at a federal level. But they have a base to feed, and they have support that they need from conservative senators. I wonder then, where is the fight right now? Because we saw, after Roe v. Wade was overturned with the Dobbs decision, we saw a lot of the fight go back to states. We saw a lot of ballot initiatives get passed. We saw a lot of, to some degree, we saw the change in law give a little bit of support to Democrats, but clearly not at the national level. And so I guess I'm wondering, where do you think are going to be the most effective ways to preserve access to abortion and reproductive rights on the ground in the next coming years?
I think it is a huge task for abortion rights advocates to make sure that people understand the connection between support for abortion access and the candidates who also support abortion access. Because what we saw in 2024, obviously, is abortion won on what, 10 of the 12 states that had ballot initiatives. And it would have, won in Florida had Florida not required a supermajority. So abortion won, but so did Trump. So I think it's a huge task for politicos to make that connection. I think for the next couple of years, there are a few more states where ballot initiatives are a possibility, but as you know, not every state has sort of that kind of direct democracy. So in the next few elections, we're likely to, the well of states where we can use ballot initiatives to make progress will sort of dry up. There are some state courts where abortion rights are still relatively untested. And so I think we'll see one thing that Donald Trump was incredibly successful at in his first term was getting his judges on the courts, right? So now it's a third of all federal judges are appointees of Donald Trump. So we know that the federal courts are going to be pretty hostile to abortion rights cases. So state courts are where people are going to have to sort of pivot to. But I think most importantly, we have to figure out how to focus the clear attention that we have from people who support abortion care, which is, as we know, a significant majority of Americans. We have to figure out how to translate that into meaningful policy change.
I mean, Katie, wasn't there kind of a example of unintended consequences in the most recent election, and where some voters who were pro-choice cast votes in favor, they split their ticket and voted for abortion rights as a ballot initiative. And then like a menu, they chose one from A, one from B, and then voted, well, like now I can still vote for the MAGA Republican. And they did that. So you end up with this perverse outcome where you have anti-choice legislators winning re-election at the same election as abortion rights are codified at the state level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I do think that people have become much more willing to vote on abortion rights since the Dobbs decision, and that's largely because we're seeing sort of the evidence of what abortion bans really do. And I'm hopeful that, as tragic as some of these stories are about what is happening to pregnant people because they can't get the care they need, those stories have been powerful in shifting the narrative and in, motivating people to go and vote on this issue. So I think we're still very much sort of in the middle of the fallout from the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Absolutely, now that we're facing like an administration that's hostile to abortion rights, aided by, both chambers of Congress that are hostile to abortion rights, we are going to continue to see what anti-abortion legislators and policymakers can do and the extent to which the American public will tolerate it. So I'm hopeful that that is a continuing conversation over the next couple of years, because I agree with you. It was a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. I think that it remained clear that abortion is a winning issue, and yet we, as a country, elected a president who is so virulently anti-abortion. At least, he says he is.
Katie,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ted. May I ask a question?
Please.
I'm assuming that we're going to see legal challenges to the Trump policy in various federal districts, and then probably in more than one circuit. Do you expect this to end up before the Supreme Court? Is it not going to be decided until the Supremes finally weigh in on it?
I mean, yes, eventually. I think the sort of scope of what this administration can do on abortion is absolutely going to be decided by the Supreme Court. Um, Unfortunately, we know that that it is a court that is pretty hostile to abortion rights too. But even some of the justices who are openly anti-abortion seem to understand that there have to be some parameters around state abortion bans. So I will just mention really quickly, there was this case that was before the Supreme Court last year about the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. It basically asked whether a federal law that requires every hospital that receives federal funding to provide stabilizing treatment to people who are experiencing emergency medical conditions, even if that treatment is an abortion in a state that bans abortion. And, some of the evidence in this case is really, it is tragic. It's heartbreaking that people are having to get airlifted out of Idaho to get the pregnancy care that they need. And so even some of the justices who you would have assumed to be in favor of every restriction on abortion possible are unsettled by the on-the-ground consequences of abortion bans. So I think the next few years are going to continue to see that kind of playing out, both among the American public, but also these judges who have to, make the calls that are sometimes life or death.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say it was heartening to see in the Supreme Court decision that we did already have on this Mifepristone case from Texas. The judges said very clearly, you can't bring a case before us just because you don't like how other people are behaving, right? And it does seem like if they were going to be able to find people withstanding to follow this path of Mifepristone safety being an issue, they would have found them already, right? So that, at least it does seem like that avenue at the highest level is closed off, regardless of what this judge in Texas keeps doing. So they're going to have to find another way. It's the Comstock Act, maybe, or whatever, some states' rights idea. But I do think maybe the silver lining here is that you do have among Trump's sort of conservative camp, or this administration's conservative camp, a few people who genuinely take issue with the idea of government overreach, and they can maybe be counted on to say like, yeah, like these are the people who are saying put it back to the states and then let people decide. I mean, that is not what reproductive rights advocates wanted, but at least there's like a basement on where that can go, because you will have some people saying this is just interference. You can't just come and say we don't like the idea that some other doctor is doing this thing. Just to, like that it was heartening, I found.
Yeah.
I have a question about, how powerful do you think both the narrative and the case are of the half a dozen women from Texas who sued over the fact that they nearly died because of the very vaguely and poorly written law that basically makes healthcare providers not know whether, basically they're waiting for women to code before they interfere with an abortion. And what I thought was just kind of like pushes a case like that way over the winning the finish line is the fact that these were all women who they desperately wanted to bear children. In most cases they had in vitro fertilization, so these are not sort of the cliche of like someone who just chose not to, I don't want to bear this child. Quite the opposite. But I was surprised that case kind of like vanished from the political landscape and from the news coverage.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much going on right now, especially but even leading up to the election, that I think you're right. There was sort of a downturn in sort of interest on this particular issue. But I do think that we're going to continue to see and hear about these cases. These women who have had the experiences of losing a pregnancy that they very much wanted and then having to wait until their lives were at risk to get the care they needed. That's really powerful. That's really powerful for the vast majority of Americans who think that abortion should be legal in most circumstances. But it's even powerful for people who have, genuine and deep opposition to abortion care. So, I don't know how this ends, because what we're learning from this is that you can't legislate medicine. You can't legislate medicine like this. And abortion is healthcare, and so trying to draw arbitrary lines is not how healthcare works in healthcare settings. So I definitely think that there's going to have to be some, I don't think that the American public are going to stand for what we have right now, which is people needing to get, insurance coverage for the potential helicopter ride they're going to need from Idaho to Oregon to get healthcare. I think what's going to be interesting to see where it eventually lands, because we now have the experience of, relying on these so-called exceptions and understanding that they simply don't work, and that trying to legislate this particular kind of healthcare just causes fear and confusion for providers and ultimately leads to like really poor health outcomes for patients.
Katie O'Connor, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us. That was the Director of Federal Abortion Policy at the National Women's Law Center, Katie O'Connor. Thank you.
Thanks so much.